Good afternoon and welcome to the artist talk for Will Kwan solo exhibition Terra Economicus, currently on view at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery. My name is Leila Timmins and I am the curator and manager of exhibitions and collections, and I will be in conversation with Will today. So to begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Robert McLaughlin Gallery is situated on the ancestral and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and the traditional territory of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Mississauga nations. For me, a territorial acknowledgement is an important reminder that we are all treaty partners and that these acknowledgements are a call to continue to recognize our co-commitments to each other and also to share my thanks to be living and working in this area. I've also just been thinking a lot in recent weeks, especially on the heels of Treaty Appreciation Week, that these are living agreements. Across the country, we're seeing these agreements challenged by settler institutions. I'm thinking about the Mi'kmaq fisheries on the East Coast, the Wet'suwet'en defending their lands from pipelines, and the Haudenosaunee land defenders at 1492 Land Back Lane, among others. And I say this as a reminder that land acknowledgements are not the commemoration of the past, but are a commitment in the present moment and a commitment towards justice. So we are here today to talk about the amazing exhibition that Will has on at the gallery right now. It's one of the most ambitious exhibitions that I've had the pleasure of working on at the gallery. And I want to make sure to thank all of the people that made this possible. So first and foremost, Will Kwan, who has produced 6 incredible new bodies of work for the exhibition. It's been really amazing to work with you on this project, and I'm excited to dig into it with you today. You bring so much care and thought and attention to what you do, and I know it's really inspired everyone at the gallery. On behalf of Will, I also want to thank the Department of Arts, Culture, and Media at the University of Scarborough for their support of the exhibition. And I especially want to thank the TD Ready Commitment for their generous support of this exhibition as well, as our core funders, the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the City of Oshawa. Without them, none of this would be possible. So for this talk, Will and I will be in conversation. So we felt that the show would really benefit from a more informal context for digging into the work. We're going to be pulling out some of the wider themes and ideas present in the exhibition by sort of talking through each of the works. And then we'll turn it over to a Q&A at the end that Ingrid will be moderating. So you can save up your questions and let Ingrid know at the end, or you can be continuously asking them in the chat and we'll make sure to get to everyone. I would also be remiss if I didn't invite you all to check out the exhibition in person. We are free and open to the public Tuesday through Sunday, and there's no need to make an appointment at this time. So please do if you are able to come see the show. And please stay tuned in our newsletter for additional upcoming panel discussions in relation to the show. And also I want to direct your attention to our website that has really wonderful documentation and much more information about the show and also about Will. So Will, are you ready for this? Okay.
Yes, I am. Just some house cleaning stuff first. It's the University of Toronto at Scarborough. My chair and my dean would be upset if I didn't make that correction.
I don't know what I said, but it was supposed to be that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Leila, for inviting me to do this show at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery. It's been amazing to work with you too. And the staff have been amazing there. I really want to personally thank Mike Drolet, who installed the show. It's been great to work with him. And then thank you to everyone who's attending today. Yet another Zoom event that you're attending, so I'm sure it's enough, but I appreciate you coming. Can I say one last thing before we start? Yep. It would be great if we could have done this at the gallery. Yeah. But the great thing about this is that I have family from other parts of the world who are attending right now, so that's a benefit. So can I just say hello to
Of course.
Libby and Locke in Vermont? I see them on the list there. And Hugh and Esther in Washington. Thank you for coming.
Of course.
When am I going to get a chance to do that again?
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, so we thought because we're not in the gallery that we were going to share some of the images of the work as we go through. So hopefully technology will be on our side. There we go. So Will and I were talking about this before our meeting today, and I think it felt fitting to begin with this work, Terra Economicus, where the title of the exhibition comes from. So Will, I thought to begin, if you could just share a little bit about this work and about what we're seeing on the screen, and to talk about maybe the title a bit and where it's coming from.
Okay, I'm going to kind of go back and forth. I have two screens going on here, so I can see the image more clearly on this screen. So I'm going to kind of look at the image and talk through it. So this piece is called Terra Economicus, as you were saying. This is something that I started in 2012 as an artist in residence at the Art Gallery of Ontario here in Toronto. You know, with most residencies, you spend some time trying to figure out what's particular about the institution and the context where the residency is set. And at the AGO, the group of 7 painters, despite, you know, despite their importance in Canada, but less so elsewhere in the world, despite their maybe we could say their limited subject matter and cultural perspective, they still really occupied a big place at the AGO. Big space physically, big space psychologically and ideologically. So that's what I ended up focusing on during my residency. It was kind of inevitable that that dominance led to me trying to make a work about it. I'm not so interested in a group of 7 as a group of artists, but maybe more about the persistence of why they're remain so important, popular for the gallery. So the title, I think we could start there. It's a reference to 2 ideas, again, persistent ideas. So it's actually a reworking of 2 ideas. One is the phrase terra nullius, and the other, which actually we haven't talked so much about, is Homo Economicus. So terra nullius is this concept, so legal, political concept, however you want to define it, that it's an idea that a territory has no owner. It's no one's land. I think it's literally means nobody's land in Latin, so uninhabited. And therefore, it's a piece of land or a piece of territory that's up for the taking. Homo economicus is this other idea, a very abstract one that's taken from economics, that is this idea that people act out or act as very rational, self-interested in their decision-making around economic decisions, about all kinds of decisions. So it's really these 2 references in the title are trying to signal to the viewer that there are 2 ways of seeing the world that are at play in the work, right? And they're kind of, maybe, let's say they're being undermined in the work. So the image we're looking at here, so when you walk into the gallery, this is what you encounter. There's these 2 elements. The element in the front is kind of like a wall or a barrier, a barricade of these semi-disassembled chairs, wooden chair parts. They're disassembled, but I think most viewers, because the chairs are so iconic, will recognize them as, here in Canada at least, Muskoka chairs, and in other parts of the northeastern United States, I think they would be called Adirondack chairs. And hopefully the viewer kind of makes a connection to how ubiquitous these chairs are in cottage, in areas where there's lots of cottages. Uh, in the photo, you can see that there's a bit of color there in the chairs. So there's a very subtle reference to the group of 7 there. The chairs are actually painted. Yeah, so they're painted from this palette of, in the end, there were 13 colors that were sampled from a painting by one of the more famous group of 7 painters. His name is Lauren Harris. And so the chairs are painted in this color, and it's a very, I would say, tasteful palette. Kind of pleasant colors, kind of stuff that would you'd associate with high-end home decor magazines, and that in that sense of tasteful and pleasant. So that's what you encounter as a viewer walking into the gallery. Behind that barricade is a video projection. And the video consists entirely of footage that I've found online and reused. And this footage is drone footage that's been produced by real estate agents, real estate companies that are selling cottages and summer homes in mostly in the areas where the group of 7 painted all of their landscape paintings. I've manipulated the footage a bit. Actually, I've manipulated quite a bit. So you can imagine the footage that was originally produced is it's meant to be very beautiful. It's meant to highlight the colors, the views, the spaciousness, the luxury associated with the properties. And those aspects are really aided by the drone perspective and the drone technology, because these are really smooth panning shots of these interiors and exteriors. So I've purged a lot of that out of the video. I've made it black and white, kind of chopped it up so that that smoothness is gone. And really, it's to kind of highlight how the camera is actually being used in a deliberate way, in a very methodical way, to try to make the camera more present in the video. And also to do that, I've put the drone sound back into the video, whereas the original footage is overlaid with pleasant soundtrack and the sound of the environment. So really what you're watching is what the drone is producing, and kind of, in a way, bringing the drone perspective back into the footage, which the drone is actually a very invasive and kind of violent technology. It's a very violent presence if you've ever been around someone who's flying a drone. Mm-hmm. So I've tried to reconstitute that, because really when the footage was shot, that was really how that camera technology was present in this space. Mm-hmm. So I think sorry, I was going to say one last thing. I think really those elements coming together in the installation is really to try to, like all the conventional ways of seeing and enjoying the landscape, from sitting on the deck chair and kind of looking at one's property, right, your cottage property, or the soaring drone view, even the canvas of the landscape painter, like all those ways of seeing the landscape, I've tried to upend that and unsettle it so that it's less taken for granted, let's say.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it really is unsettling in the space. This view that you're seeing now, I mean, you come around the corner and it's like this wall of chairs hitting you, and the drone sound is, I mean, it's really aggressive feeling in the space itself. I think we should pivot to the second work, Mountain Pose. But Will, maybe we can talk about just a bit about describing the work, but also picking up on sort of your last point about the view and sort of these sort of context for viewing the landscape and sort of being present within it.
Or like a way of seeing.
Way of seeing, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So this is an installation called Mountain Pose. So in the gallery, the viewer walks into the space, and there's this like maze of. I think in this installation, there's 8 of these contour models. And they're models of mountain ranges that are raised up on these metal stands. And then most viewers, I think, will recognize that the models have been cut out of these sheets of foam exercise mats that you commonly see in a yoga class, for example. And then behind in the image you showed at the beginning, there's a wall of mirrors, and on the mirrors are these sandblasted images. I think there's about 14 of them in total. So if you get close, you'll be able to see, and they're kind of floating on the mirror, and they're actually quite subtle, and you kind of disappear actually as you get closer to them. So there's all these there's all these different cues for the viewer to pay attention to. One important cue is on each of the metal stands, there's a brass plaque. So you can see it there. I don't know if you can read it though.
Probably not.
Yeah, so these plaques identify the mountain ranges that the contour models are depicting. They also name a place that's set on that mountain range. So this one is Simla. There's other ones, that people might recognize, especially if you know your geography and your history. You'll start to make connections between all of them. So I think there's Darjeeling is another one. Mussoorie, Landour, Lansdowne. What's one in the southern part? So Mahabaleshwar. So there's a bunch of different mountain ranges and locations that people can start to recognize if they know the Indian subcontinent. If you do know your geography and history, you'll know that these places are identifying what are called hill stations that were built during the period of British colonial occupation of India. So the hill station, I think, is an important starting point for this work. So hill stations were these, I find them very interesting. There were these mountain settlements that colonial governments throughout Asia, not just the British actually, colonial governments built throughout Asia, and they were used for things like sanitaria, for military outposts, like kind of forward bases in kind of terrains at the frontier of a country. They were also often used as summer capitals. And I think one of the key reasons why hill stations exist, and is one of the focus of the work, is has to do with prior to contemporary understanding of disease vectors. There was this idea that diseases were transmitted through it's called Miasma Theory, which is this idea that diseases are caused by bad air in low-lying areas. And in order to avoid some of these diseases, you try to get away from these heavily populated places with bad air. So it prompted the British in India. It was one of the reasons that prompted the British to build these settlements in these higher elevations in the subcontinent. These mountain settlements also turned out to be really good places to have a summer capital, where where your colonial officials could decamp for the summer and govern subjects from a distance and from above. So on a governance level, it seems symbolic and appropriate as well. There's these images here. There are actually some of the, I think the one on the right for sure is from a hill station. There were these weird places that were built as replicas, as British towns. And they were, centered around a church, around picnic grounds, playing grounds, these manor houses for colonial officials. Class and segregation played itself out in really explicit ways in these places, especially in, you can see it in these images here, just the logistics of getting up the mountainside and moving around these hills was, not something that, colonial officials wanted to do. So they had these are, and there's different names for these things. Sometimes they're called Sedan chairs or palanquins. And there were these conveyances, and this is a common sight in the hill stations. Mm-hmm. These images are some of the images that are sandblasted onto the mirrors behind the contour models. So I think this work starts with the hill station. It's fascinating to me because it's a geography and a history where this desire for purity and segregation and distance is all tangled up with this complex intercultural encounter of colonialism. Mm-hmm. Then the other part of it is the other big element of the work is yoga. So how does any of this connect to yoga? So in my brain, I kind of see that entanglement I'm talking about mirrored in the particular way that yoga has been embraced in the Western world, throughout the world, actually. So yoga is this funny kind of universal embrace of activity, this activity that crosses a cultural divide. There's an intercultural history to it. We don't really think about it in those terms, but it's there. And it happens to come from the Indian subcontinent. So I think there was this, in my mind, there was this link somehow. I think the thing about yoga also is the way that I look at it is, it seems to be, at least like in the most kind of pop cultural sense, really fixated on the self, let's say. People who promote it and the way it's celebrated in pop culture kind of cherry picks elements that tend towards talking about it as activities associated with purity and separation and a kind of focus on one's body. And then of course it's dehistoricized, right? It's kept at an arm distance. There's a kind of arm's length distance from the broader cross-cultural history of its origins and its consumption in general. So I think that if you're in the installation, I think the viewers walking through the installation, they're kind of, all of these little clues are placed in front of the viewer. They kind of hint at these very persistent, sublimated ways that we encounter other cultures, but also how we do things to keep them at a distance.
And Will, is it true that the hill station areas have also become sort of these global, or not global, but these centers for international yoga tourism?
Yeah, there's an aspect to that simply because they are now just Indian towns, yeah, resort towns for the Indian middle class, for travelers. I think there's the kind of pristine mountain views, isolation, like that's the perfect backdrop to have a yoga retreat. So yeah, there are these retreats that kind of bring the whole loop
back together. Yeah, that somehow makes this kind of relationship that I have in my mind about these very disparate activities and histories. Somehow that there's a mirroring there.
So, oops, I'm gonna walk us into the next work. So I'm hoping we can talk about this larger text-based work that is in neon. Yeah, can you talk about sort of this text and why you were drawn to it and sort of what's happening in this work?
Yeah, I think when we talked about putting this show together, we were talking about things that I've made and was working on that somehow in a very loose way dealt with landscape and land and the natural environment. So this is a line taken from an Emily Dickinson poem. The poem's like longer, but I think this is the first line. I think this is actually the title of the poem. I think I'm just drawn to it because it's there's something in it was an insight there, let's say, about seeing and knowing through a kind of reverse perspective, knowing something through its absence or through its loss, through its dispossession. So I think that's why we included it in the show. It's really big. First of all, it's hard to see. It may be easier to see in your previous image. So it kind of looms over most of the works, and I think we chose to place it in the gallery in a way where at any point you turn around and it's there. You see it from every position in the gallery. So I think it's meant to loom over all of the works in this show as a way to frame everything, as an underlying idea for all of the works.
And can you talk about the choice for it being unlit? A neon that.
Yeah, I guess it's meant to just further manifest that idea, right? That it's the absence where you don't see the thing. It's in the absence that you see the thing for what it is. Let's say, because if the neon was lit, we'd see the light. We don't see the apparatus that's lighting it. You don't see the current that feeds the neon and animates it, illuminates it. So I think it was just that sculptural choice to mimic what the text is saying.
And I also see it as sort of this refusal of the sort of like commercial reference of neon as well, or some of the other art reference of neon. But
yeah,
that might be me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, neon signs for sure. For me, it's less about that because as an artist, you see so many neon signs that other artists make. So in the gallery, I kind of see it as, if anything, a reference to all the other neon signs that artists make.
Yeah. Well, the next work, is illuminated. So this series is called Meta, and it's a series. Oops, sorry for navigating this poorly. It's a series of these 6 lightbox works, and they're also bringing text into the show. And I'm just hoping you can talk about your choice around pairing images and text, and sort of, again, where these images are coming from, and sort of what's happening in these works.
Yeah, so the first image you showed is likely the the first thing that the viewer coming into the gallery sees, right? So you're walking towards the entrance and you see this single image that has no text. And it's just this hand holding this clump of soil, and there's nothing, there's no card next to it. There's no text to tell you what you're looking at. So I think we placed this here to, at least for me, it was about trying to have this first image where the viewer is actually is a little bit more active, trying to figure out what this is. But as you said, there's 6 images in this work, and they're split. So the first image, that full frame image, you see first on its own, and then you come into the gallery and there's a series of 5 images that are a series. So they look like this. They have this photograph on the top and then text along the bottom. So the first image that you see is ambiguous, right? It's this hand holding up this soil. The gesture is ambiguous. When you start to look at these 5 images in a series, I think you have a photo of them side by side, right? Yeah, you're kind of looking across and you can see clearly that all the photos have a similarity. I think when just looking at the images before you read the text, if you look across, I think the viewer can start to see that some of the images, the soil is actually quite saturated and viscous. So I think that's yeah, the image on the left, there's, by the image on the far right there is, it looks like it's very greasy and viscous. So I think maybe that idea was that even just looking at the image, that somehow you start to realize, okay, maybe this is not an image associated with gardening, for example, but something else is happening. And then you read the text. So I think some viewers will recognize the text as possibly referencing metadata tags. So metadata tags are keywords that get embedded into digital images, so that when you do an online image search, there's an identifier that can help to pull from the huge archive of images online, and your keyword search will pull and list all of those images with those tags in your search results. So these metadata tags are, it's a mechanism for sorting and archiving images. So generally, they're very straightforward and literal. They describe what's in the image. Even if somebody is responsible for having to put in the words. So a decision is made about what words to tag to what images, right? So there is a perspective there. The 5 images, actually the 6 images in the work are taken from an online image search that I did, actually a couple of searches, for the keyword bitumen. It was a word I came across and wanted to know more about. And the other, it was a phrase, it was about Alberta. I think it was Alberta tar sands, because that's what gets pulled from the tar sands bitumen. And these were the images that floated to the top of the search because they were tagged in the images. All of the images were produced by stock photography companies, which is another big part of the work. So these are companies that specialize in archiving and now really producing and warehousing images that get used by anyone, by designers, by people in the media and the press. You do an image search now, and a lot of the images you get are owned or produced by stock photography companies. So that has a consequence for how subjects or an area of knowledge gets represented visually. The keywords that are actually in the works, though, are that I've paired with the images are not straightforward. So I've written the text there. Some are actually taken literally from the metadata tags that are associated with the images, and then I've inserted other things. So the words are not straightforward. They're not literal. They're much more expansive. They're tangential. They're maybe unexpected. I mean, you could say they're more candid about what's in the image. In some cases, a bit more lyrical. I think the words are trying to hint at the possibility that photographs can only have a very tenuous connection to the truth now, and that are certainly inadequate to reckon with complexity. I think that's what the words are trying to do. And I think this is included in this show because the subject matter deals with land as a resource that we extract from and destroy as a result in many instances. But I kind of see the work also as about how we're separated from land and how land is used and all of those kinds of processes. So how it's kind of become an abstraction that we understand through images and through media, as opposed to actually physically experiencing the land, because I've never been to the tar sands and most people haven't.
Mm. Yeah, and the images themselves are, I mean, they're wonderfully ambiguous, like they're very ambiguous in what's happening in them and the sort of offering, and what is the offering. Like it's not immediately clear that it is bitumen. Yeah. Maybe that's also a nice way. I feel like the next work that we were going to talk about is also, and in a different way, the image itself is kind of ambiguous in what's happening in it. So yeah, do you want to walk us through what is happening in this work, Terroir, Terror, Terroir?
Yeah, so this is my idea of a landscape photograph. It's about 20 feet long, and the photograph is of the Green Lane landfill, and that's a landfill just outside of London, Ontario, in a place called Southwold in Elgin County. For those of you who live in Toronto or Ontario and driven along the 401, just west of London, Ontario, on the 401, you'll have passed it without knowing it's there, unless it's a really humid day and you can smell it. You can smell it from the highway. So this is a site that was purchased by the city of Toronto in 2006 after Michigan decided that they no longer wanted our garbage, and there started to be barriers to shipping our garbage down to the States, although my understanding is that's happening again. So the majority of Toronto's household waste goes to this site. It's you can kind of see more of it in the right side of the image there, and those mounds, those cells, they're called cells. Anyways, Toronto's going to be sending our garbage there for the next 2 decades. There's enough space there to house our garbage for the next decade. Although there's already plans to look for other landfill sites because we're producing more and more garbage, even though we're talking about recycling and climate crisis. In any case, all of our garbage is trucked and discarded in that landfill. On top of the photograph, superimposed on there are 4 descriptions that I wrote. And I wrote them in consultation with a sommelier. So a sommelier is, I'm sure most of the people listening know that sommelier is a wine expert who's trained to identify and categorize wines based on their taste and smell. So
I asked a sommelier to, his name is Peter, to come with me to the landfill and use his training to help me come up with a description of the scents and aromas and the kind of olfactory profile of the landfill and the surrounding landscape. It's interesting because the sommelier has this mix of knowledge. It's a kind of mix of food science and chemistry, but a lot of it is also subjective experience and identifying. And there's a kind of imaginative quality to what he does, to try to smell something and identify it in a way that someone else will be able to identify it.
Yeah.
And the way that they describe wines. In fact, all of the kind of food and wine scene has this really imaginative way of describing things. For this work, I read hundreds of wine reviews and tried to learn the lingo. Terroir. So the terroir that's referenced in the title is used in the wine industry, maybe in the food industry too, I imagine, to describe how the characteristics of a place influence the flavor, the color, the look of a wine. So it's really about this kind of fixation or this focus on the land, the climate, the soil, the terrain. It's this approach, a particular approach to land. Very different from some of the other works, but at the same time about land. So I think this work is kind of a satire of that fixation. There's an undercurrent of taste and elitism in wine connoisseurship, wine enthusiast culture, right? In how they describe things, the obsession with localness. I think that's true of foodie culture in general now. So it's a kind of satire of that. I'm also hijacking the lingo and the jargon that's used by these, this vernacular that's used in these industries. And then, of course, I'm applying it to a very radically different form of land use, which is the landfill. Yeah. I think landfills are very controversial in urban planning. They're both necessary, but they're also a menace that often gets foisted on more marginalized communities that lack political power to determine where these things get cited. So that's a part of the work as well. So that's why the title is this kind of back and forth, right? For some people in Southwestern Ontario, terroir is about their wine. And then for some people, the terrain is about, the suffocating air or threatened water sources, these trucks that kind of arrive on the hour, every hour during the week, offshoring Toronto's garbage. Yeah,
bringing in something that is very not local.
Very not, exactly, yeah. That's a good way to put it.
I am conscious of time, so I want to bring us to the last
work. Yeah.
So load. I know there's so much to talk about the work, so we'll open up to questions in a second, but yeah, can you give a bit of context, describe sort of what we're seeing, and maybe just talk about some of the choices around the objects?
Yeah. So I think this is the most personal work in the show for me. These are household objects filled with water. For the audience that's familiar with a Chinese home, some of the objects are more particular and recognizable. So then there's like a tofu container. There's a
earthen pot there that's used to cook rice. There's stuff that's used, like teaware that's used to make tea. There's plastic objects that you'd see in household goods stores in Chinatown. In each of the containers, there's a plastic flower petal that's floating. And those petals are cradling a needle, a magnetized needle. And the needles have been magnetized so that the point is actually pointing south, not north, which is the traditional way that you make a homemade compass. It's a way of making a compass that is actually very ancient. It likely comes from China, it's my understanding. But we probably recognize it as something that is done in schools to teach children how the science behind how a compass works, poles and things like that. What else? The title, Load. So this is LODE. And the title refers to a lodestone, which is a magnetized, naturally occurring magnetized stone. It refers to a lodestar, right, which is a light source that guides orientation. It's also a play on the word load, L-O-A-D, which is associated with, say, baggage or weight. So it's a word that's playing with all of these things. Maybe I can say, for me, this work is actually a portrait of, it's a portrait of first generation Chinese diaspora. And what I mean by that is, I see in the first generation, my parents' generation, this really interesting tension, like a really enduring tension between, let's say, Canada, at least for myself, and the Chinese Canadian diaspora, this tension between the adopted country where we live now, and the ancestral home, which one is left behind. And the latter has this really profound hold on their imagination, their worldview. There's an attraction there. It's always drawing you back, whether it's language, whether it's what's happening in the home country. My father spends so much time listening to Hong Kong news these days. It's just something about this tension between two homes. So really the installation is about that idea of home or homeland as both, it's manifested in the installation, let's say, right? This physical orientation, but also this emotional weight. Right? And that weight, I think, for me, what makes the work poignant is that it's activated by this very vast, invisible force, which is something that transcends countries. It's something that is actually physically part of the planet, right? Which is the polar North Pole, which these needles are inevitably drawn to. So you see in the photograph, all of the needles and the petals all point in the same direction. So it's a portrait of a community, let's say, and something that's happening in the community.
It's nice to end with it too in that way of, I think what we were talking about is all of the works in the show are really, you can locate them, like they're about a place, or in some way they're about more than a place, but they all are at least tied in some way to a location. And this work does something really nice that expands beyond that. It's still about orientation and place, but in a much wider global way.
Yeah, part of the piece is the magnetic North Pole, right? Which is floating somewhere around Canada.
Near Baffin, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's moving to Siberia. That's the last I read.
think it's always dangerous when artists and art workers start talking about science. But yes.
Let's stop there then.
No. But yeah, let's stop the screen share and bring Ingrid in and see if there's any questions. And if there's not, there's more that I can lob at you.
I see a question from Linda. It's about the color of the mountain ranges. Yeah, that's a good question. They are, so the placement of the contour models in a very loose way approximate their position on the Indian subcontinent. So towards the mirror is the northern side with the Himalayas bordering Pakistan and Afghanistan. I think I chose the colors in a way where the cooler colors were closer to the northern side and the warmer colors came towards the southern side. So it was determined to some extent by the colors of the yoga mats that I could source, but I chose those colors to kind of like a heat map, let's say, so that they flowed in a particular way from coolest to warmest. I don't see any more questions. Do you?
No, not yet. Ingrid, have any questions come in?
I think we just had the one from Linda so far. But if anyone would like to ask any questions, feel free to populate it into the Q&A. For now, maybe we can just continue chatting a little bit. And if anyone thinks of anything, yeah, feel free to jump in. You can also add it to the chat if that's easier as well.
Leila, now's your time to ask all the questions that you've ever had for me.
Well, I feel like I've been able to ask all of them, but maybe I can. Do you want to talk about poetry? You can say no.
What do you want to talk about?
What do I want to talk about? I feel like when we were installing the show and sort of seeing all the works coming together, and reflecting back on some of Will's other work, Will did a big installation on the Don River called A Park for Everyone. Is that cool?
A Park for All, yeah.
Park for All. And did a work at the AGO for Nuit Blanche a few years ago. And I know that sort of text features heavily in your work, or you often bring text in. But I was just noticing, I think with fresh eyes or for the first time, that like poetry is also been coming into the work or referenced in different ways. And I mean, we've talked a little bit about it, but yeah, poetry, yeah. Poetics in the work.
I think as an artist, I like working with text. I was trained as an artist that approaches art making in a conceptual way, in an idea-oriented way. And for artists that work in that way, language is very important because it can communicate very complex things. It can communicate in a very direct way. But at the same time, like you were saying, it can be evocative, right? Language can be deployed in that way. So I think that's where that comes from. I wouldn't, if there's any poetry in the work that I make, it's poetry written by other people, by poets, by actual poets. But I do use language in a way that tries to not be overly literal. I think I'm interested in ways that people use language. So like the sommelier, I'm interested in the vernacular of that culture. The metadata is just another way of playing with language. I think I might try to loosen it up a little bit, but it's a long way from actual poetry. The Emily Dick, the water is taught by thirst. That's taken from a poet. The piece I did at the AGO, those were all quotes from poets. So, I mean, yeah, maybe that's just another area of language that I'm becoming more. I'm finding more in, but I wouldn't say that I grew up reading poetry, or that, you know, I'm gonna end this call and go pick up a collection of poetry. It's less about poetry as a form, and maybe certain words being useful for a certain idea.
Yeah, the power of language. We are getting questions.
Do you want to choose some?
Sure, or Ingrid?
Yeah, it looks like we have a question again in the chat from Hugh Howard to both Leila and Will, or a comment. And then the question from Hugh is, Will, can you explain a little bit about your thought process?
My thought process is all over the place. I'm interested in everything. And that's to my own detriment. You know, I'm curious about everything. So in my studio, there's hundreds of clippings and sketches of things that potentially I would do. But yeah, so my deadlines probably are the thing that helped me to eventually make something. So, but I think I'm just curious about everything. I don't know if that answers your question, Hugh. I hope so.
Hugh, feel free to reply in the chat. If you have, we have another question in the Q&A.
It's a great question, though, Hugh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Interesting, thank you. We've got another question here in the Q&A from Ron Wild, asking which of these works will most likely springboard you to future projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm doing a lot of work with photography now, not photographs that I make, but photographs that other people have made, especially, you know, companies that specialize in making a certain kind of photography, and working with that to try to try to reveal something about how we rely on images these days in a way that is becoming more and more challenging as a way to understand the world, how photography makes things more complicated. So I think there's something about working with those images and trying to understand why those images are depicting that particular subject, and how they arrived, how I arrived, how I got to them, and all of that as part of how we use digital technology now, how we do research, and how we understand the world through our screens. I think maybe that's one area that I'm still thinking about.
Great. And we've got another question in the Q&A, an anonymous question here, asking if the video work in Terra Economicus.
We also got a question asking if the video in the work Terra Economicus has audio.
Yeah, that's an easy one. So I'll just say yes, it does. It's the sound of the drone. It's not the sound of the actual drone from the videos, because there was no drone sound in the videos. They were removed and overlaid with much more pleasant sound. So I've created a soundtrack where the drone sound, the sound of the drone camera and the drone itself reappears, or is present. So when you're in that installation, you're hearing this grinding. I mean, Leila can tell you, it's very disconcerting, unpleasant sound.
Yeah, it's awful, intentionally so. feeling?
It looks like, so we just had another question pop up, an anonymous question. Will, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about why you're interested in working with art historical references and how you think about the purpose they serve in your work.
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot because it does happen in my work. I think it's about audience. So in the gallery, the likelihood is you'll have a lot of people who are interested in art, who are art professionals, who are other artists. So that reference is one point of connection into the work. I don't make work that is only about art history. I kind of borrow from art history to talk about other things. So it's maybe just it's a pairing of those things so that there's different entry points for different people in the audience. So you can understand, I hope you can understand that, I hope you can understand the work through the subject matter, but that, so anyone can understand it, but then there's also like a reference, there may be a reference in the work that's art historical for those who do know those references, for maybe, let's say, for my fellow artists and people in the art community. I hope that was a good answer.
All good answers. We have another question from Linda in the chat, and it is, do you think of yourself as a hopeful person from an environmental perspective?
Well, from an environmental perspective, I'm not hopeful. But generally speaking, I would say I'm hopeful. The work in the show, some of it does deal with environmental issues. So I can understand where that question is coming from, Linda. Yeah, maybe even in an environmental sense, I'm hopeful. Let's see what people do. I think for myself, it is becoming more of an issue, and maybe that's why it's coming through some of the work as well. So I think it's something everyone's thinking about. Maybe we should all be a little bit hopeful. Again, I don't know if that answered your question in a satisfying way.
Thank you, Will, and thank you to everyone for attending. For those of you who are here, you can let your friends know that this was recorded and will be up on the RMG website to share. And please, again, I'm going to plug it. Come see the show. We would love to have you. And so thank you.
Thank you, Lila. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Libby, you, Esther, Locke, Henry, Elizabeth. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay, bye.